You have a chip in your hands. Why? I mean, like, I can say a why, but like, all right. So let's talk about that.
Totally.
What's the utility of that? What's the why? What's gained, and memetically speaking as well.
Totally.
Like, how does that manifest?
Totally. Well, memetically, it's part of the narrative, right? Like the fact that, so the project, for those unaware, is if you tap your phone to my chip in my hand, you get an NFT of my face, one of 5 different rarities, of course, and you can only get it by meeting me in person.
The Collectors.
All right, everybody, thank you for being here and welcome back to the latest episode of The Collectors, where we feature the biggest brains from around the NFT and the Web3 space to talk about what's hot and what they're building. And today is a special day because we are bringing in one of those big brain builders, and it is one of the many Matts. You can find him as that on Twitter. We'll share the link to everything inside the show notes, but for now, please welcome him here so he can drop some knowledge. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy.
G'day, sir, Matt. Pleasure to have you. Maybe just to kick us off, maybe give us a little bit about your background sort of prior to your sort of NFT,
Totally.
sort of crypto life, and how you got sort of an overview of how you got where you are today.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, it's much like everyone else. I got nerd sniped by crypto, in my case, 2017, and at that point, you know, I realized that I could actually understand the white papers, and that was a huge, like, brain blast moment of like, oh my God, I actually get this. It's something that I understand and can be real. Whereas before it was, you know, I didn't get it, so I didn't get it. But very quickly found that it wasn't the money or the DeFi that was interesting to me. It was almost entirely things that played off of my literal collector instinct. I've always been in a sort of battle between my desire to collect things and my sort of non-reliance on physical space, being nomadic, that sort of thing. So when, you know, you have this sort of intersect with digital ownership and this idea of truly owning a digital thing, you know, I'm hooked. And so, yeah, that's how I got into NFTs. I ended up you know, being part of the technical community that was working on the standard 721, 1155, that sort of thing. And sort of, yeah, just thinking about owning digital things. And via that, got into art history and sort of like all of these discussions, the discourse really that people have been having for decades and truthfully like hundreds of years since the Renaissance and even further, related to things that we talk about today. And as part of that journey, you go back and you see and you find these sort of landmark moments where people have ideas or produce art about an idea, and recontextualizing them in the world of today just shows them to be so prescient, so like on point. And that's been a really fun journey to go back and, you know, via sort of like following along everyone else in the space and learning about all these artists from the 50s and 60s and so on. And just like old ideas are new again, but like now maybe their time has come, that sort of thing has been really, really cool.
It's really amazing to see the journey people take in this space, because for a lot of people, they may not care about the artistic side of it, but they have the exact same journey when it comes to the principles of moneyness. What makes something money, and these monetary systems that we've had dating back millennia, and what's old is new again. And we have these new rails, but we're rediscovering these old ideas of ownership and fungibility. That's kind of what you're talking about here, right?
Totally. Yeah, it's a lot of the same ideas. And I mean, like, specifically within the art realm and NFTs, you have Sol LeWitt, who's like, it's not the physical thing that is the art, it's the idea itself. The idea is a machine that creates the art. And like, you get to got the zones of immaterial sensibility, who's I'm blanking on this person's name. This is like really core to my my whole bit. But this artist from in 58 talks about like you know, intangible things as being physical, and sells intangible works Klein. Thank you, Eaves Klein, of IKB International Klein Blue fame. Anyway, sells non-tangible works for physical gold and has this whole process, and you own a receipt, but the receipt is not the thing. And as soon as you look at that, you look at NFTs and you go, oh, I own this physical digital thing, this receipt, which is not the thing, but is a pointer to the thing, but like is a container and a memetic sort of holder for the thing, but it's not the thing. And they were talking about this in 1958, right? Like it's just really, really cool. And exactly to your point, money as well, like all of these old ideas that, either we intentionally lost or forgot over the last however many years it's been, are coming back. And that's really cool.
Yeah, I love thinking about this connection of art theory and art history and NFTs. I'm sure we're going to dig into it over the course of this hour just to think about all of those different avenues. And it's amazing how, this is making maybe some of that thinking more accessible to people who never thought about it. People who were very much on the left side of that bell curve, meeting these people who are very much on the right side of that bell curve from history, even whether those people know they're in the space or not. Like there's that thinking that informs what we do, whether we realize it or not, and then realizing, we're all really talking about the same things in that language. So in that vein, MC, I know you wanted to talk about this idea of memetics that Matt is bringing up.
Yeah, I need to unmute myself, don't I?
Yeah.
It's helpful. Look, it's what I was watching one of your previous interviews, and what strikes me, and I wish I had other examples because I just sound like a fanboy, but I feel like 6529 has really eloquently touched on a lot of these things. Yeah. And his big thing, which sort of anchored in my brain, was this whole idea of memetic rails, and he's got this whole thing, sees the memes of production. He's got all these projects about probably basically taking over the idea factory. Whereas the idea factory used to be very top down, or has been traditionally top down. So everything now is starting to be sort of ground up, and these memes kind of touches on this whole concept of art, this intangibility, this abstract notion that's being now ensconced in this container, as you mentioned. Yeah, totally. So it's kind of without me sort of going on a chuncher, like how now that we've sort of gone down this, I think we're really actively exploring this where we hadn't before. It's really front and center. I think a good example is Doge, which started out as I quote unquote shitcoin, and now all of a sudden it's got some sort of value. But I think the question is, how does something like that become culturally valuable, and does utility even matter? Is it even relevant anymore?
Totally. Yeah, I love your question about utility, because I also utility feels like a reductive aspect to the value of something. To use the frame of utility is to ignore other aspects of what can make it meaningful, which by and large are massive parts of it, aka what do my friends think about it, is a really important sense of value that is not captured by the idea of utility. But yeah, I think you made a great point, which is that memes are a very explicit idea, or memes as something that we have a label for, and something that we can perform science about via memetics or something. We have we're conceptualizing the idea of these ideas that spread, is something that's very explicit these days, and wasn't so before. But the idea of memes and people believing things as this mind virus thing is universal and has always been here. We just have language and an explicit discourse about it now, which I think is quite interesting. But yeah, no, agreed. And Dogecoin, serves as a vessel for the idea of, well, it's a lot of things, and it's a very specific idea, but broadly, the dog. It's unclear, right? If you try to put Dogecoin into a word that's not Dogecoin, you struggle. But that's just due to the infinite specificity of memes and how you can't condense that. But yeah, it's a really interesting time, and that's a big part of why where I'm going with this is memes and NFTs, and especially like ownership of memes and NFTs as vessels for these sort of abstract ideas. Very real thing. It feels like a medium, something that will be built upon.
We're going to talk more for sure about ownership and how digital ownership has been impacted by Web3 rails and what disintermediating ownership really looks like. But I want to dig into what you're talking about with utility, because you yourself have done something I find fascinating from a utility standpoint, and coming also back to the word vessel. You yourself are the vessel of this utility. You have a chip in your hand. Why? I mean, like, I can say a why, but like, all right, so let's talk about that. Totally. What's the utility of that? What's the why? What's gained, and memetically speaking as well? Totally. Like, how does that manifest?
Totally. Well, memetically, it's part of the narrative, right? Like the fact that, so the project, for those unaware, is if you tap your phone to my chip in my hand, you get an NFT of my face, one of 5 different rarities, of course, and you can only get it by meeting me in person. And so that's a narrative, right? Memetically, like from like an make this thing interesting perspective, putting it in your hand is interesting. But what I think it really does is it adds, I need a better word for this, but it adds naturalness or derivation, let's say, to the scarcity of this digital thing. Because digital things are inherently abundant, or rather their scarcity is arbitrary. Why 10,000? Just because it's a fucking number, right? There's no reason for 10,000 of the punks to exist, except 10,000 felt like a good number at the time. But I was always interested in how do you create meaning, and it seems that part of that is how this thing is created, or how this thing is distributed, or like the scarcity curve, or like how it exists. And so to that effect, these MAT tokens, by virtue of the way that they're created, imply that the owner has met me or has purchased it for whatever reason from someone who has. And so there's this sort of transitive property of meaning going on here. And that was what this project is all about, is how do you give meaning to these digital things? Because if you just handed them out willy-nilly, that's a different signal than tapping your phone to my hand.
Sorry,
go ahead, man.
I was gonna say I want to riff on that for a second, because what instantly popped into my head, is you were talking about, you have one of 5, I suppose, that will generate off that contact.
Totally.
Have you thought, or is there a way to do every instance a unique instance or a unique NFT to that one moment in time? So it's maybe not just an image of you, but it's a completely generative experience. That would be fucking crazy. Like, because every meaningful interaction is actually captured.
Totally. And it's you've taken this ephemeral abstract thing of meeting me and compressed it in like a sort of Newtonian fluid way. Bam, just like that. It's a physical or tangible, I should say, memento of that occasion. Totally. Yeah. I think that's
it's the essence of meeting you more than it is the essence of you.
Into that token. Absolutely. It's
well, the thing is still in your hand.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. But it's like, that is literally what's being encoded, right? When people receive this, a lot of people, it's their first NFT as well, since I pay the gas. It's such a distinct way to give this digital thing, which maybe it's without this experience, it's just a picture that they received. But with this experience, it's a moment in time of having their mind blown, not only because of this NFT delivery mechanism, but because they've never met someone with a chip in their hand before.
I think that's fair. Most people.
Yeah, it's kind of like a more nuanced version of like, let's take a photo together. I don't know. That's kind of what's going through my mind.
Yeah. And right now it's like real clunky, right? Like that, let's take a photo together and then send it to our DM. Like that's a really useful tool, and it's really smooth. This is obviously like very different in some regard. And of course, as the artist, the first person who's done this, it's super worth it for me to do it. Should someone else do this? I don't know. But yeah, it literally is trying to encapsulate or freeze frame that moment.
And does you know that's an interesting...
super cool. I mean, I now need obviously to collect this very badly.
Yeah.
Well, that's one. And Tor has his own NFTs, similar. It's a POAP, right? That's what it is.
That would delight me to no end.
Yeah.
Well, I think we also wanted to get to talk about just the idea then. Like, you have this chip. It can routinely generate new instances technically of yourself every time you're met. Something new is being generated. As long as you are available, that ownership is available. And it's making me think about a lot of different questions then around what it means to have something, like what it means to have ownership over something that's technically not scarce, but in its generation, in its provenance, is still scarce. And what does it mean to own maybe art or music that's universally accessible in storage somewhere, but the ownership is scarce? Like, talk to me a little bit about that. Well, how does that change things psychologically for a creator and for a collector?
I think that shift of this is like the shift that we've seen in the last 10 years is a transition from status being associated with exclusive ownership and specifically like you own a painting, it hangs in your room and no one gets to see it otherwise. That equating value to, because of the invention of the internet and actually sort of paradoxically the infinite abundance of data itself on the internet, value is not in owning what someone else doesn't have, but in owning what that person also has. It's a reversion of exclusion to inclusion based mechanics. And both of them just form barriers, right? The definition of a barrier is that on one side there is inclusion and the other side is exclusion. Both of these do the same thing, right? If you own a Renoir, that is, you're now this person that owns a Renoir and someone has to go see it, and that gives you some sort of status. And the reverse is also true. I own a Supreme shirt, and now I'm in the group of people who also own Supreme shirts and care about them, right? And it's the same mechanic, just not the same mechanic, but it's the same result, just two different ways of getting there. And I think that's one of the massive shifts we've seen with the internet, is that value is defined by what other people have seen, aka memes, rather than what people haven't seen and want to see.
So I like this idea, or I should say, like, I prefer this idea that we're talking about inclusion as opposed to like having to define out groups in the Web3 space. And it's like everyone is finding their true tribe, more so that like because it's getting so much easier to generate culture, like at a base level, it's getting harder to imbue it with meaning because we don't necessarily have the same universal audiences that we had in, when everybody watched I Love Lucy at night. But it's getting easier to create a base layer of content, and then it really is up to that community of collectors engaging with the creators to imbue it with that meaning. And I think you can't get meaning from purely defining what is not. Like, who we don't include is the meaning of this cultural asset. It is, I think, more healthy, more sustainable, and maybe a long tail of meaning and community in this fractal and fragmented Web3 world that we're entering. It does make more sense to define it on a positive space versus negative space. This is what it means to be part of this, as opposed to saying, we've put up this wall, and outside of this wall, this is what you cannot be.
Totally. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
To your point, like the fractionalization of culture, right? Like, I think meaning is hyper dependent, almost like fundamentally dependent on having some shared substrate by which people, some sort of social substrate by which people collectively understand objects. So if you think about fashion, everyone has to wear clothes in our globalized society. And that provides a canvas to a degree of self-expression. And now you have this sort of emergent property of stylizing these clothes to reflect your identity. And that creates this, the fact that we all live in the same three-dimensional space and see each other in this space, and importantly, socially interact within this space, creates meaning for fashion. And you see a digital parallel with like Twitter PFPs, right? This is a shared substrate, importantly social, in which these objects can have meaning. And I think that that's like one of the massive prerequisites. And so to your point, one of the things that's happened, of course, with the internet is the fractalization of online space. There's no more universal substrate. The closest thing we have, at least in the crypto space, is Twitter. But that's not the same as everyone on Earth sharing three-dimensional space. And so there's something interesting there related to these substrates, but it just means that when you create this community, you're creating something hyper local, hyper specific. And so you think about all of these different, projects with communities and cultures and stuff, like these are all hyper specific versus, let's say, like, I don't know, the natural dilution that occurs when you're all operating in the same space. That should be teased out more, but I think that's something interesting that's happened, is that there's no shared space. There's no universal shared space on the internet. And we don't want that, at least aesthetically. If you think about that, it looks like Facebook being the only website. But there is something lost in the transition to a fully fractal internet as we have now. So that's something I think about a lot when it comes to like generating spaces in which objects can be meaningful.
Like, are we really looking at ownership here and direct connections between creator and consumers? Are we really bringing back this much older idea of like a patron society? Is it totally something that's actually maybe more like each individual relationship with the creator is more centralized, like those traditional structures, but it's not happening only at the upper echelons of society, right, where the patrons are just the Medicis or something?
Totally. Yeah. And I think that dovetails into what MC said earlier about like, what is the point of ownership if everyone can see it? And I think the answer from like a psychological perspective is this idea of patronship, this idea of my name is next to the thing. Like at the end of the day, that's all an ERC721 is your Ethereum address next to a number. And that is so powerful. And I think that, especially 2 to 3 years ago, less so now, that was like a big sticking point for people on this sort of transition of value being exclusionary to value being inclusionary. It was like, why would you pay for this thing if everyone can see it? All you have is your name next to the thing, where the reverse is true. It's like, yeah, I got my name next to the thing that everyone knows about. Like, isn't that sick? Isn't that so fucking cool? And I think that ties directly into patronage, right? Like, that's basically what they were doing, was commissioning works that like was a play dunking on some other kingdom and then being like, I made that, right? Like, that's basically what this is like, look at me. And so I think that's a really powerful like psychological property. And I mean, yeah, it's not just patronage, right, that gives you, but that's definitely there, is this idea of patronage. And the other thing that comes to mind when I think of that is like the powerful effect of just owning something, like my name being next to this thing, and this like feeling of ownership is fundamentally new in the case of digital objects. The internet today is defined by this idea of not being able to own digital stuff. This is why like musical artists have gotten a hard time, historically, like visual artists, net artists, all of these digital artists historically have a hard time valuing their work, especially like, and that's because of the sort of infinite reproducibility of data. It cascades all the way down into like, if a museum is buying a video work, which necessarily is valued less than, a painting, when the artist delivers that physical work, they do so on a USB that they've felt the need to like gussy up basically and have it be a physical container for this ephemeral work, which just points at the problem of like these digital things didn't feel like objects. They couldn't be owned. And now they can. And that's a massive, massive psychological shift.
I mean, you could always take it to the next level and put the entire installation on an NFC chip in your other hand. And then the installation can't play unless you're sitting in the booth. It's like we got Matt over here in the chair. He's got to be here, or else the installation doesn't play.
Yeah.
He's got the private key in his right hand. So if we don't have Matt in the building, none of this works. I think that's a good way for artists to hold on to the value of their art, but it certainly makes it a bit less scalable.
Well, yeah, and also is like distinctly scarce, right? If I like the idea of, but also that performance art literally is like perhaps worth doing. It points at the problem. It's like, this is what, the equivalent is for these physical objects. You're like keeping this thing hostage. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll give you my ENS and I'll take 0.5% of the royalties, but otherwise, good luck to you, my man. I think we got MC back too, and I know he wanted to talk about something else too.
Yeah. Well, I'm just again riffing on this idea of ownership, because what do we physically? It's about something you can protect, I suppose, with like with a gun, right? Like I have this property, I can protect it,
totally.
That sort of, but this other idea, and this goes back to the
just like
yeah. So the ownership really is just another. It's actually almost a different label of another
I think
kind.
We lost you again.
Well, we can definitely jump off from that and like
we can riff on that for sure. Yeah. No, totally. Oh, you're back. Okay, so ownership, definitely previously, like enforced by monopoly on violence in general has been the like either you defend it yourself or the state does it for you. And there's something new and different about digital ownership not requiring that. You're secured by the violence of entropy, let's say, and how it's impossible for someone to guess your private key given current constraints. Quantum computing, I don't know anything about, but I've been told to fear. And that's new and interesting. I mean, of course, I don't know. The joke, of course, is the wrench attack is, the cheapest attack on someone's private keys. But yeah, I don't know. That is very interesting. I wonder how that dovetails into like, I don't know, structures of society and how people interact.
We're ideal. I mean, the idealism view would be, we're evolving past the need for enforcement through violence.
Yeah.
And then we have to reckon with the fact that much of our presence is still physical, right? Can you really transcend violence if you can always have an implicit threat of it? It doesn't need to be state level violence, but it could be individual P2P level violence. And then do we need state level actors who have physical presence to protect us from P2P violence? And then you get back to the reconstruction of the state. But I think that at least when you think about other ways to secure digital property rights that don't require violence for enforcement, you start to think about the role for an enforcement state differently. It is not to ensure people don't come into your house and rob you or say that their assets are actually theirs if the blockchain is not supposed to be questioned. Really, the role of the state is still to protect not ownership, but physical safety in spaces, not thinking that somebody would take what is ours, but could still take our lives or our livelihoods. And maybe we then have a better relationship with the state when it doesn't start to believe that it needs to police all interactions in order to even secure something like property rights, just maybe to secure physical safety if we infer a human right to like not be attacked in the street.
That's awesome. You've thought about this. That's cool.
I think about too much shit, man. Don't worry about that. I mean, I don't have all the answers either, and I don't have a chip in my hand. I just get on a podcast and we try to hype it out. But
it feels like the digital world is very much subservient or falls back to or cascades back to IRL, right? Like even for meaning related discussions, like at the end of the day, we're physical, three-dimensional social beings, and the metaverse does some type of job in emulating that sort of space, but it's clearly not the same. And so even I even I, of course I have this compulsion to put my NFTs on the wall, right? Like that's not where they want to be, but that's where I want them to be. And that's, I think, kind of interesting and sort of falls back to this discussion about physical space as well. It feels connected. And, to evaluate digital space without remembering physical space is to lose a lot of context.
Gotcha. Well, let's go back to this question about fractal digital spaces, because you did make me think of something that we've brought up on prior podcasts, which is to what extent the layer one matters. And the reason we talked about that on a prior podcast was mostly in the context of ordinals, where that was the first time we saw a different truth machine of value, however you conceptualize a blockchain or a time chain. You're like, here was something that actually has even more economic security than Ethereum, but it's the only other base layer that has more economic security than Ethereum. And now that's being used, not in a necessarily efficient way, but in a way where we're saying now this can also secure digital property rights. And I, going back, dating myself, in 2015, was writing my MBA thesis about the use of colored coins, for example, for digital rights management. That's not how things worked out.
but that's so sick. What a OG flex. That's awesome.
It's a fun flex until you read the thing and you're like, God, this guy was a moron. He predicted everything wrong. But still, it was nice to think about
colored
it.
Coins were so ahead of their time. It was like, how do we get? Yeah, totally.
It was insane to think that but people were aware of the problem, and more importantly, they were aware of the potential solution, which I thought was so cool. So now we're talking about fractal digital spaces, not just in terms of here's the Facebook social layer, the Twitter social layer, Google sign in with Apple, and having that be your identity abstracted away and behind this privacy layer. The L1s themselves, we keep witnessing this. Things go crazy viral on this L1 and no one finds out on another L1. Something mints out on Solana, ETH collectors never find out. And meanwhile, Tezos is shipping these one-of-ones that ETH collectors don't value. So why does the L1 matter? Is it memetics? Is it something about the economic security? Is it visibility? What is driving the difference in value chain by chain?
That's a great question. I've felt this, but haven't really interrogated it. So this is a great opportunity to do it live. Yeah, like when Tezos does something, I like my instinct, and this isn't something I'm proud to admit, is just I don't care. And I think, and it's not about economic security, because maybe that was relevant in my thinking years ago, but these days I haven't thought about economic security literally in 2 years or something. It feels almost entirely memetic, this idea of the truth layer, right? And that's also why L2s that roll up to Ethereum feel better or more aesthetically pleasing than other scaling opportunities, even if they're objectively better, right? There's something going on with the memetics, and maybe it's just the Lindy effect. Maybe it's just I don't know. Maybe it's just Schelling point theory, but
but you're speaking for yourself still. It's also a degree of familiarity. I know you're not trying to say the market has spoken and this is the only thing, because obviously if it was a Tezos creator on here, they'd be saying it the other way around.
Totally. Yeah, no, this is me, right? And, part of that is definitely vested interest, right? Ethereum is what I learned when I was getting into the space. I understand it much better than any other blockchain construction. And so things that are not the EVM, I'm, unsure about. And also vested interest of I own NFTs on Ethereum, but also, there does seem to be this sort of, network effect largely of interest in Ethereum. And, it might just be that. It might just be network effects. And it's not being first that matters, but being the first relevant one.
Right.
Perhaps.
Well, there's the social network effects, and then there's the economic network effects. There's so much money from the ETH ICO that will never, ever leave. And that's what I mean. So the economics matter, but maybe it's not economic security. It's just the fact that we have free capital that we're willing to turn into social capital. And on other blockchains, there is no surplus of economic capital. And also the social capital isn't as valuable.
That's a great point. Yeah, totally. Turning financial capital into social capital is very much something that like I've done consciously, right? Like, oh, let me buy this NFT, not because I think it's going up or anything, but because I want to collect it, and my friends are doing that. Like that's a super valid thing. And yeah, definitely the economic security was important to me in the past, especially in terms of like reinforcing the idea of true digital ownership, because digital ownership, just owning a digital thing is, you know, you can own something in a database, right? Like that's digital ownership, but the nature of true digital ownership implies staticness. Like this thing isn't going anywhere. Like it's going to be here in 100 years, and like it should be here in 1,000 years. Like this is the kind of like feeling that contributes to the idea of true digital ownership, and that sort of bookends this psychological effect of making this thing feel tangible.
Right.
And I think that...
So that happens at the base layer and also at the asset layer.
Yep. Happens at the base layer, happens at the asset layer, and I think that's a sort of a transitive property, right? Like L2s on Ethereum inherit some amount of that. It's not lindiness, but it's like this thing's going to be here-ness. And that's very important, I think, for feeling.
Well, the more L2s connecting to the base layer, the more you have to feel the base layer gains that lendiness. Whether or not that extends to the L2 and the assets deployed on the L2 has a lot more to do with the fact that these L2s are their own little fiefdoms with you know, various differentiators. I just think it's fascinating to just dig into that broader issue, because, you know, what maybe we want the base layer to be as static as possible and the asset to be as evolutionary as possible. Maybe we want these cultural assets to change, but in a provably programmatic way. They will not change in a way we don't expect them to change. Even the base layer changes in ways that we don't expect it to change, a shift from proof of work to proof of stake. But if your NFT suddenly begins representing something else, like what happened with the Goblin Town stuff, like that's weird. Then we're like, what does this mean?
Totally. That's actually great performance art in retrospect.
Yeah. Does it make it more valuable?
I mean, honestly, yeah. Like, there's something there. Like, the story is everything.
Sure.
But yeah, the that feeling of like, is this thing going to be here? Certainly a year ago, and even now a little bit, like, when friends ask me like what chain they should put their art on, I'm like, it's literally not a question. It's, if you need a lot of volume, okay, think about an L2. But like, if you want your work to be relevant to the discourse, like, don't choose one of the L2s right now. You have to put it on mainnet. And I haven't broken down that feeling, but it's a feeling that I've had.
Sure.
It's like deploying something on Polygon almost guarantees that it feels like a Polygon project. Putting something on Arbitrum has the same thing. It's like, it doesn't feel real.
Interesting.
Yeah. And maybe this is like mainnet elitist or something, but this is a feeling that I've had.
It's fair. I mean, as long as you're aware of it, because if everybody universally is aware of that exact same feeling, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in itself. If everyone assumes everybody else has that feeling, then that's exactly
right there.
That's where that comes from.
Yep.
And we do deal with this at Stashh, right? Like, this is a thing. We're a multi-chain marketplace, and we have the social layer and we have the ownership layer. You know, this isn't a podcast to talk about Stashh, but this is why we've thought about it so much. We support Ethereum, Polygon, Arbitrum, Solana, Tezos. All these chains are supported on platform, and you see different user behaviors from their chains. But there's also this element of game theory where Ethereum collectors and creators are the most protective of that lendiness, and every other blockchain is motivated to tell a consistent narrative that maybe the L1 doesn't matter so much as the utility or so much as the community or anything else. It's the incumbent, it's the largest, most lindy, most Schelling point base layer that has the incentive to tell the story of having that soundness, and everybody else collectively is sort of operating against it. So over time, there's this constant erosion because we keep launching L2s, we keep launching new chains. We come from the Cosmos ecosystem where there's a new L1 every week. So there's always this slow erosion. Is that something you can even fight?
That's a great question. I mean, I honestly have kind of checked out of especially competing L1 like stuff. Like I haven't even, I don't follow it. But I think there might be an effect here where, of course, if a project is on L2, they're sort of by prerequisite of them existing, or like definitionally, they have to have an assumption that the L1 is not, a prerequisite to their success or their like relevance, or their whatever their goals are. And I think that's totally fine. I'm definitely like, yeah, a lot of my framing, what I like to do when thinking about projects is take a future frame and say, okay, the year is 2050. We're looking back, what was relevant this year? Like what got us to where we are today? You're designing a museum exhibition and trying to describe the world. You're trying to say, like, how did we get here? And what are the things that are on that little timeline at the bottom of the museum that they painted on the wall with little tick marks that say like, oh, the first blah, 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 or like whatever, like what are those things that's happening? And I think that's a really useful frame for thinking about like, yeah, when art is launched on Ethereum, like autoglyphs, for example, it's like, yeah, that's going to be on there. And that's something.
So let's jump. No. I was saying, listen, we could have talked about that for another 10 hours, but I have like 7 other topics. Well, we'll pick and choose the ones that I think you're the most positioned to talk about. Let's jump straight into then, like, I'm also fascinated with the social layer. And I'll ask this question very specifically, right? The social layer used to imply personhood was a single person. And that has a lot to do with the physical space that we were in. If you meet someone, you're meeting an individual. By law, there's accountability for a single person. If they break the law, that single individual is incarcerated and somebody else walks free. There's a lot that has to do with this idea of individuality versus society versus community. And now we have DAOs. DAOs are creating, DAOs are collecting. You have groups of people. We have AI. We have essentially these non-conscious agents that might represent no humans. So we've gone from everything where it's like one person, one agent, to multiple persons, one agent, to also no persons, one agent. And all of this is having consequences for like, what does it mean to be a person, an agent, a creator, a collector? So what's going on here? Let's start with the DAOs and then let's talk about AI, because I think that's the right way to bookend it. Let's talk about what it means to have multiple actors acting as a single agent or a single entity. What have you've experienced this? Talk about your experience and then let's generalize.
Yeah. Before, as a footnote, the idea of, one person, one thing that's been really cool to see enabled by Web3 is the sort of allowedness of having these situational identities be like consistent identities that are named. So like you can have an alt that is like this type of personality, which we had before. We just couldn't make it concrete. So I think that's a really cool thing that we get to see now. But yeah, DAOs are, you get into what is an entity, right? What is a dynamic system? And if you really want to get metaphysical, it's like, how do you define something as living or not? Like, what level of complexity is a system said to have a soul, right? Like, there is a sort of, like, you can conceptualize humans as input-output black boxes. You can conceptualize neural nets as input-output black boxes. Like, they are a network of sufficiently connected nodes, each having an individual experience but contributing to a whole, and it is able to modify itself, and now suddenly we have consciousness. This pattern feels like, to me, like it's applied, like it's being applied, or is emerging in smaller degrees within humans interacting, right? The nation state is a hyper object of all of its peoples. The DAO is a hyperobject of its members. And these sorts of abstract, non-existent, but real entities have always existed. But one of the cool things is that we can give them a bank account now, and we can give them an on-chain identity. We can give them aura, right? Like previously it was like, oh, this town doesn't like this type of food. But now it's like, you have a DAO of people with money who only collect this type of art. And like, you can argue that this is an entity performing some preference. And, you can take this even further and talk about autonomous AIs, or not autonomous AIs, autonomous artists, like Bado, like Abraham, which are a DAO that produce art via, various AI mechanisms and users, contributing to this thing. No user is an author, but everyone has authorial intent. Like, it's true to say that no one individual made the art, but the artist did. And so, like, yeah, we're going to start to have answers to these questions, especially as AI and neural nets like become, they increase that level of complexity.
Should we be conceiving then of like, let's talk about AI for a second.
Yeah.
Like when we look at how these LLMs are working, or any of these generative art platforms are working, I'm always thinking to myself, should we be saying that this is really the result of no human influence, like we cannot infer consciousness in the action? Or are we supposed to be seeing it as the sum and product of all human interaction, all prior human thought and cultural generation? It's just that we can't trace it because it's so weird to try to pull out that history from what we're able to observe as the end product. Yes, the event, it's gone. It's weird.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's how, like, I don't know if this is true, but this is like one model of the brain and learning, right? Is like you have input and that affects the internal processes, and some of that is stored in some way and some of it's discarded and you never see it again. But at the end of the day, you have some compressed state that is constantly modifying itself due to input. And yeah, that's basically how you train a neural net too. And you provided input, and then suddenly, neurons are updating their weights and shit. I'm not a scientist, but like, this is my understanding. Neurons updates their weights, and you have this sort of evolutionary process, not evolutionary, but cyclical process of input, update, and you have this condensed state in which none of the input is still there, and yet it is able to produce, some sort of output that is consistent with those inputs. So yeah, it asks a lot of questions about, like, where did the idea come from? Ownership of that idea, like who made the thing? Was it everyone on the internet? Also with the AI researchers that compiled and formatted the data, plus all the people in the Philippines working for Scale AI, evaluating images, right? Like, all of this goes into the thing, and yet no one is in charge, or no one is in control of that, and yet everyone is. And I think that that's just something we're going to have to think about now. And of course, like, this has always been there, especially with ideas. And like, you build on top of an idea, you make a derivative of a meme. Like, yes, that person contributed the base meme, but like, you did something valuable too. It's like, this question has always been here.
Are we going to care about organic memes? That's what you're making me think of. Like, we think about organic food, right? Where it's like, you're going to have to put right on the label. It's just like, this was ethically farmed AI. Every member of this like Mechanical Turk group was ethically compensated for image tagging, and their royalty streams go directly to like it, because it's the same sort of thing. It's like, eventually a consumer has to care about this. If the people who are buying the end product or subscribing to OpenAI, like, if they don't care, how is it possibly going to be true economic incentive wise that this is going to end up being a consideration in our process of law, in our process of creation? Like, if it's so abstract like this, right? Like with organic farming, you might even be able to say, like, here is the farmer who was harmed. Here is the person who was harmed by having pesticides in their food. But the more abstract, the more digital, and the more we uncouple this from a physical place where we can say one human, one piece of accountability, one responsibility. Doesn't this just get like impossible?
I would agree. It gets impossible. It's kind of like how I had read somewhere, and this is from like a 1970s book, so maybe this is outdated, but like the way that decisions are made in Japanese companies is by committee, such that when something bad happens, it's no one's fault. It felt relevant. That came up in my head. It seems like a really hard problem. I don't have a solution. It seems really, really difficult. And yeah, I'm not as optimistic about people caring. How, on what data are these things trained upon? I would love for people to care, but I don't know. I don't see a path to that future laid out in front of me at the moment.
Well, this leads really great into our last wrap-up question for you, because now that we've talked about organic meme farming, we are going to talk about this idea of sustainability and sustainable value. And I think it's the perfect question to kind of wrap up everything we've touched so far. We've talked about the lindiness of the base layer. We've talked about what it sort of means to ascribe value to something based on both its economic security or availability of capital, but also its social capital, all these things. So my question to you then, you're a creator and you're a collector. Clearly you think about how you value things today. You, to some extent, think about how they'll be valued and by whom they'll be valued in the future. With a space like this where things change, the narratives change, the memes change on a minute by minute basis, is there anything that we can say as we go from like scarcity to non-scarcity to scarcity again? Is there anything that we can say is really going to drive sustainable value for both creators and collectors? Or is this just in perpetuity a moving target? And can we build on a foundation that's fluid?
That's a great, yeah. I think it is. I think meaningness, let's say, is one of these hyper objects. It is a river, right? It's a fluid substrate, and when you look at it in any one moment, it can seem static. It can seem constant. You can say, "Oh, people like this kind of art," but that's always an illusion. And so, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, especially because the meaning of things, their relevance to humans, which is really what's important, right? Like one of the things that will never be taken away from humans is their ability to care about something. And importantly, for another human to care that another human is caring. AI can't replace that. And for whatever reason, what we care about changes all the time. And when you have a fluid substrate like that, I think your hyperobject is also going to be something that is inherently temporal, and will be changing forever and ever. And so, yeah, there's a sense that some things are, let's say, less entropic than others. They're more likely to be here. They're less likely to fade into the digital background radiation of the universe. But at the end of the day, I imagine it all does.
Life is ephemeral.
I mean, you've blown my mind. Yeah, MC's back on here. He's back on here to wrap it all up. He was getting pithy with it too.
It's I mean, it's funny. At the end of the day, I feel like this is what brings us all together. There's a philosophical bent, that ties us together. Certainly, us being the front runners of the technology and establishing new paradigms and applications. So, I mean, we could, and there are endless rabbit holes, right? So, because we're nowhere near mature in this tech and application. So, totally. That's the beauty of what we're doing is we can talk endlessly about it and riff and then try this, and then we put it on rails, right, and see what happens.
Yep. Totally. Yeah, that's like every few months I'm struck by the meme is, of course, we're so early, but like, yeah. Sometimes you feel that.
Well, thanks for being early with us today, man. We really appreciate you, all the deep thoughts and everything else, and knowing that we're talking to a practitioner. I know that we're going to see some of this out in the world to some degree soon, and we're all going to have something to take back with us as we keep building. So let people know just in this last minute here, where can they see more of your thinking? Where can they see more of your work other than physically cornering you and scanning your hand?
Totally.
How can they get a hold of one of the many mats?
Totally. Yeah. Find me at a conference for sure. Get a mat NFT. But I am one of the many mats on Twitter with the number 1 because of Twitter's character limit. And if you are on Urbit, Malbus/Nifty is the channel where I post just interesting NFT links. But I also do that on Twitter, so you don't feel like you're missing out. But yeah, that's mostly where to find me. I will not open Discord, so don't find me there. But otherwise, I am online.
I love it. I love it. Whether you're on Urbit or whether you're on Twitter or maybe soon Blue Sky or maybe soon Stashh, man. I mean, these are where that process of discovery is what we all care about. And so we're thrilled to see what you discover next and what you build next. Matt, thanks for coming on and jamming with us on the Collectors.
Hell yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, mate. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.